Hello, everyone. Welcome to Manta's Small Business Expert webinar series. My name is Ivy Lamb, and I'll be your host for today's event, Succession Planning, Ensure the Future of Your Family Business. Succession planning is an important but thorny topic for many small business owners, especially if you own a family business. We're very happy that you've joined us today as we discuss common succession planning pitfalls and how to avoid them. We'd like to thank Prime Corporate Services for sponsoring today's event. Before we dive in, I want to cover some important housekeeping items about the event. During the webinar, you should see a slide area, which will allow you to view the webinar. You'll also see 3 tabs: Ask a Question, Attachments, and Rate This. Click on the Ask a Question tab to submit a question at any time during the webinar. We'll do our best to respond during the Q&A session at the end of the event. Under the Attachments tab, you'll find more resources and educational materials related to today's topic. Go to Rate This to leave us feedback on this presentation, and you can also tweet about today's event using the hashtag MantaExperts. If you're having technical problems, please email webinarhelp@manta.com. My colleague Graham is on hand answering your technical questions, so just send him a note. Now on to today's presentation. I'm very excited to introduce our guest expert today, Bea Wolper. Ms. Wolper is president of Emmons & Wolper Law Firm in Columbus, Ohio, where her practice focuses on succession planning, estate planning, oil and gas law, contracts, and the buying and selling of assets and businesses with an emphasis on family-owned businesses. She's also a co-founder and advisory board member of the Conway Center for Family Business, where she facilitates the Women's Peer Group and the Succession Planning Peer Group. She is a frequent lecturer and writer on succession planning and family business, and we're very grateful to her for generously donating her time today to share her expertise. Today, she's going to discuss some of the unique issues family businesses face when it comes to succession planning. She'll talk about why succession planning is about more than just transfer of ownership, and some of the common problems that crop up during the succession planning process. Lastly, she'll go over some important tools and strategies that can help you successfully transfer your family business. Also, just as a reminder, you can submit a question at any time by clicking the Ask a Question tab, and we'll do our best to answer at the end of the webinar. Now, I'm going to hand it over to you, Bea.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think the interesting thing about family business, unlike other businesses, is even though the board, the playing board, may be the same, like chess and checkers, if somebody is just planning a regular business and they want to think about the future, it's sort of like playing checkers. The only thing you really worry about is tax. If you have a family business, it's more like playing chess. And by that I mean, if you make a move, you absolutely can ruin Thanksgiving dinner for a long time. For family business, there really is often no space between what is family and what is business, because it really always overlaps if you have a family business. So there are core values for a family business. When you do have a family business, legacy and stewardship are so important because what's going to happen down the line matters. Respect, not just for the owners, but for the next generation. How do they earn respect? How do you get respect when your employees have babysat you when you were a young child? How are you kind to your employees? It's very interesting. Employees of a family business are very loyal, much more than other businesses, and family businesses are very loyal to their employees, much more than other businesses. That's why family business employees stay around sometimes through multiple generations. And the generosity of family business cannot be underplayed, especially with philanthropy. So as you go through, there are key issues with the successful transition from one generation to the next. The first, and probably the most important, is communication. It does not help if you have an older generation person who is convinced that they just are not going to say who's going to run it, when they're going to run it, and what happens if they die. Because most older generation have a little trouble acknowledging that death is a reality. It's so much easier to avoid the conversation, deny that it's ever going to happen, or procrastinate and say, I'll talk about that tomorrow. Communication is key if you're going to have a successful transition. Compensation is so important. Many times people end up paying too much or too little to the next generation. I'm going to pay them too much because, after all, I need to pay for my grandchild's private school, so I'm going to pay them more. Or I'm going to pay them too little because someday this will all be yours. Now, succession of leadership and management is key, and there are two different things. One is from a 30,000-foot view, where is the family business going to go from generation to generation, and how do you set the tone at the top? Succession of management is who is going to run it day by day. How are you going to pick the person who is in charge of getting it from point A to point B? When you're talking about succession, many lawyers, unfortunately, consider that the transfer of a piece of paper is all there is to the succession of a family business. But in fact, succession of ownership is the easiest thing to do. You just sign the back of the paper and you've given somebody ownership. Not so easy for the succession of authority. If in fact you have turned over the business, but all your employees and your vendors and your customers and your clients call you if there's a question rather than the next gen, you have not successfully turned over the authority to the person that you had wanted to be able to take over the company. And the corollary to that is, if you are thinking of doing a succession in the near future, I would suggest that you take your next generation with you when you go to the bank, when you go to your vendors, when you go to your customers, and introduce them to the person that you believe will be taking over your company. You need to have a 90-day catastrophe plan. Even though nobody expects it, bad things happen. So you want to be sure that if something, quote, bad, unquote, happened, that your bank and your accountant and your lawyer and your customers and your key vendors and your employees, although they would miss you, will be able to continue the business. If your goal is the continuity of the family business, and over 90% of all the people who own a family business want it to continue to the next generation, then you need to plan on how to do that. I mean, the same is with values, the succession of values. If you remember in The Godfather, Michael Corleone, didn't want to have any drugs. I mean, he was a mafioso, but he didn't like the drugs. But if you remember, the next generation, Sonny, he thought that was a wave of the future. They did not have their values aligned together, and that can always create problems. Another thing is to talk about those topics, getting back to the communication. You want to talk about the things that everybody wants to avoid. So the first one is the non-discussables. So if in fact the oldest child has a drinking or a gambling problem and nobody ever wants to talk about it, The owner may leave the stock to that child because, we're just going to leave it equally, which is not the way it should be done. And then you are leaving something of value to someone who could make it not last to the next generation. And to do a proper plan, the people around you need to let the owner know if, in fact, he doesn't have any clothes on. So that's that story of the emperor's new clothes, where the crooks came to town and pretended to weave a cloth that only those people who were smart and wonderful and brilliant could see. And nobody wanted to tell the emperor that, in fact, they couldn't see it, and the emperor didn't want to let anybody know he couldn't see it. And so everybody went along pretending that they could see it, and of course there weren't any. And it took a child to say, he's walking around without any clothes on. So you have to be able to know that. So this is the topic on the compensation, where you often pay too much or too little. That someday this will all be yours is really not sufficient. Although we have had family businesses where the next gen had worked for over a quarter of a century, knowing that someday he would be able to take over the business. But during that time, that was the basis and the most part of his compensation, because the owner kept saying things like, I struggled when I started this. You should struggle when you are working in this. I just wanted to take this opportunity to take a break and to say, don't forget, you can ask questions. And Ivy will be looking at them and we will discuss them. So a family business leader has many characteristics, and one of them has to be that you have to be dedicated to the business and the family. What you don't want is somebody who's just dedicated to the family. And by that I mean, if your family business is only in business to take care of the family, it will not last to the next generation. Your family business needs to be in business to make a profit. And so we'll talk more about that later when it comes to employing people in the family. A rude awakening is that not every family member can run the business. There are family members that cannot. And just because you have an older child, especially, if you go back to Europe, the oldest son may not be equipped to handle running the family business. You need to figure out who is the best and who has the best qualifications for the job. Sometimes a non-family member needs to be president. They are better equipped and they are better qualified. We had a situation where there was a death and a 28-year-old took over the family business, and even though that was the plan, it did not happen according to how the owner thought it was going to happen. He thought he would have many more years to transfer the knowledge and everything else to his son. But he died. And the 28-year-old decided, because he was wise, to make a person who had been in the company for years the president of the company, at least temporarily, while he learned the rest of the business until he could take it over in a management leadership position. So sometimes a non-family member needs to be running the business. The next generation coming in also has to have authority. Getting back to my first topic. The authority is mandatory. And does it have to happen on day one? Certainly not. Succession is a journey. You have to travel along and learn how to do it. But if you are not given any authority and all of a sudden you have all the authority, your employees and your customers will leave the sinking ship. What you need to do is teach authority and teach it young and teach it early. And then you'll be able to have the authority that accompanies the position that that person is going to have. The next generation has to have the relationships we talked about. The customers, the vendors, the employees, the bankers. Every single loan that I have seen will have two provisions with the major banks. They're in very small print, and they're near the back, but if you take a magnifying glass, you'll be able to find it. And the first one is, if Mr. or Ms. XYZ dies, we're going to call the loan. The second one is, if at any time the bank feels uncomfortable, we're going to call the loan. So given those two provisions, what you want to do is take the next person to the bank. Talk to the bank about your succession. Talk to them about what you have in place. Tell them your plan so that it will run smoothly, and talk to them about agreeing not to use those two provisions to call the note if something happens. So there are common hurdles that go with family business, and it's hard to talk about all of them in an hour. But before I even start on them, let me say again, family business is the best thing since sliced bread. I absolutely agree 100% that it is the best business to be in is family business. Yes, there are hurdles. Yes, there are issues. But in all the years I've been doing it, and I've been doing hundreds and hundreds of successful transition from one generation to the next, there was only one that I could not overcome. And it had to do with sibling rivalry, where one brother at 57 told the other brother who was 60, "You never let me play with your toys growing up." And consequently, because they had inherited the business 50-50, they could not agree on which way the business should grow and what it should do, and it eventually split the business, and the business no longer existed. So if you are planning early and taking care of the issues early, you can have a successful transition from one generation to the next. What's fair is one of the biggest hurdles. We call it holiday planning. When I do estate planning, we have to talk about avoiding holiday planning. Holiday planning is, it's starting to be the end of the year and you're thinking about giving gifts to kids. And so you always give the gifts equally to the children. If you have two children, you give them about the same value, 50-50. If you have three, it's a third, a third, a third. You get the idea. When it comes to family business, people make a tragic mistake. How about a fatal mistake? By if there are, for example, 3 children and one of them is in the business, a parent, because, they can't decide between kids and they want to be fair, so they give the business a third, a third, a third. Time passes. The 2 people who are not in the business, we call them, mailbox shareholders, because at the end of the year, they only want to go to the mailbox and see what money has been sent to them for their share. They decide to sell the business, and they have the vote to do that. And even though the third has been working there, they don't have majority control. They don't have the vote. And in fact, that happened to a company in Indiana, to a friend of ours who was president of the company for, his whole life. And he hadn't realized that Grandpa had left it to his dad and his 2 sisters, a third, a third, a third. And in fact, the 2 sisters sold the company. So what's fair, we have to do it so that it's the leaky roof system. When the person who's working in the business knows that the roof is leaking, they also know we have to fix the roof. We need to take the money to fix the roof. The ones who are not there don't care about the roof leaking, and they just want money. So you have to watch what's fair. Blood employment. You need to watch hiring people just because they are a relative. This is, are you in business to make a profit, or are you in business to take care of your family? So when your sister calls you up and says, my son just graduated from college in jewelry making, and he can't find a job, but you have a successful business, so I'm assuming you're going to hire him, the correct answer would be no, like the song. And the word is no. You don't hire somebody just because they're blood. You need, the next one, self-discipline. But it also goes to, gee, it's a beautiful day. I think well, not in Columbus. And I think I'll go out and play golf. Your employees are going to watch. If you are the next gen, you really have to use discipline. Denial, avoidance, and procrastination, that's what makes people not do it. So when you have somebody who is 62 and they hope to retire at 65, at what point do you pass it on? You should be starting already. And if you have one child who is the only one helping with the business, that one child should have the voting stock of the business. If all of your wealth is in the business, then you need to talk to an estate planner to figure out how to do it. But it's not a total third, because the child who's working in the business, who would get the business, you have to at least give it the, what we call the 3 a.m. headache discount, because that's the one that's going to wake up in the morning worried about, can you pay your employees' payroll? So you need to be starting early, transfer early, and you should have a buy-sell. There's a lot of tradition where you don't want to just give it to the oldest child. That's the problem that runs into this desire for harmony that I put up. The problem with that is the famous quote, and it's usually the mom, why can't everyone just get along? Can't you just get along? Why aren't you getting along with your sister? Can't you get along with your brother? I just want everybody to be happy. Unfortunately, you have to plan, and you have to have that dreaded word, communication, and you have to say, this is why I'm doing it, and this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. So it has to be very clear. And so you can move things quickly. You can have an exit strategy, even though it's late in the game. We had somebody who started it at 87. Yeah, that's not a miss. I didn't misspeak, really. 87. Finally thought that his kids at 60s were old enough to maybe take over the business. But we actually were successful in doing it. You just have to keep moving, and have it done. Fear of retirement and fear of death really go together a lot. Part of the problem is, and many people have said this, a family business is like a fifth child. The owner has spent more time with this child than with his birth children. And so giving up that 24/7 being with the family business, there is a lot of, what will I do now? I don't have anything to do. I don't know what to do. I have no plans. I have no outside, hobbies that I like. I won't have anything to do. And so what should be planned is something, it's not make work, but it is a plan for that owner as he moves into relinquishing all control and the stock is what they're going to do. And there always some control element that you can put back in. So for as long as the family business is owing you money, you can have a certain say of what it can do and what it can't do. You don't want, for example, the family business to owe you money, and then the people decide that they want to change this manufacturing company into a restaurant. You would be able to veto that decision, and rightfully so. You would not want that to happen. So some of the tools for a safe and a easier transition, and the first one we're going to talk about is a buy-sell agreement. A buy-sell agreement is vital for any time a family member, more than one, owns a piece of a family business. And people will come and say, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, this is family. We don't need to have a buy-sell agreement. I disagree. I really think that everybody should have a buy-sell agreement. What happens if? And so the what happens if will cover death. What happens if there's a death? If there's a death, and again, most owners don't like to say, well, I'm giving, my child 10% now, and I'm going to give 10% a year, and, over the next so few years is going to be, but they don't want to think, well, what happens if the child dies? Let alone what happens if he or she dies. What happens if the child dies? A buy-sell agreement will cover what happens if death, how it's bought out, when it's bought out, how long it takes, what the note looks like. Can you save some of your stock for a family business trust, which we'll get to in a minute? But it should cover all of those different things in the case of death. And the next one is, well, what happens if I'm disabled? Well, it depends how much you are disabled. Now, if you are totally disabled, but this is going to be your retirement fund, you may not want it to abruptly end. You might want to be bought out so you have something to live on. If you had sold some of your stock to your children, but something happens to one of them, they are disabled, do you still want them to own the stock? It's something that you should talk about with your estate planner. How do I get the stock back? How severe should the disability be? Should it be permanent? Does it mean he can't think, or does it just mean that he can't move? So you have to decide what that means. The next one is the dreaded D. So far we've done 2 of the 4 Ds, death and disability. The third one is the dreaded divorce. So I've given some of my stock to my wonderful son, and he's terrific, but he's going to be marrying a woman that we're not particularly fond of, and oh, wait a second, now they're getting a divorce, and she wants to claim part of the family business. That would be no, and it's no because in the buy-sell agreement, we have already said, no, that's not going to happen. And so you write it out right in the buy-sell. Now, obviously, almost all of my family businesses, I beat until all the children have prenuptial agreements. But I understand not everybody can do that. And so you can take care of it in the buy-sell, and you can take care of it in your trust. But the buy-sell should cover divorce. And the last D is dissension. What happens if we don't get along anymore? What happens if I want to get my stock back? What happens if I've changed my mind? What happens if the guy stole from me? What happens if the guy's competing with me? What happens? What happens? How do I get the stock back? And that's what the buy-sell agreement says. If this happens, this is how you get your stock back. And oh, by the way, if the guy's a crook, you're going to have such a huge haircut on the price, he's not going to get anything for his stock. And so you talk about not just when you get it back, but what the value is when you get it back. Very critical. So this family business trust is literally a trust that is set up so that if, in fact, you have ownership of the company, let's make it up, and you're 45, and you have kids that are coming out of college and have shown a great interest in the company and, in fact, are working in the company. They've started working in the company. You would want your trust to be set up so that if something happens to you, your child could inherit the family business, even though too young to do so at the time you would die. Let's say he's only 18 or 16, but he's been working every weekend and he loves it and he really wants to own it and he can't wait to be king, just like the Lion King. The Family Business Trust is a special trust that permits stock to be held in trust in order to wait until that person is old enough to enter the family business. And we usually say over a certain age, 5 years working in the company, having people report to them are some of the requirements. And the Family Business Trust is permitted in the buy-sell agreement, so they would go together and they should be done together. Entrance requirements. This is another tool. It's very, very handy and a good idea for family business to plan ahead how they're going to bring the next generation into the family business. Sometimes people will say, you can come in whenever, I don't care. Sometimes people say, no, I really want you to go out and get a college degree first. Sometimes people say, or the military, or I want you to work in another company for a while. And they have written rules on what somebody should be doing before they can come into the family business. And then they have rules about what is needed. For example, I said, jewelry making, and there's no position in the company where that person actually could do something at the company. You don't have a position for them. So you don't make a position just because it's family. You have to think about what does it mean to add something to the bottom line. So it has to be, if somebody graduates in finance and you have need of a controller who could someday be the CFO, well, that's a natural. Or if somebody's graduating in business and they want to learn HR, that's a natural. Or marketing, and you have need for it. You have to have need for it. So our entrance requirements are very, very specific. And it also has requirements after you're in. So, for example, if in fact you are in, but you are constantly embarrassing people because you are at the local pub drunk, there actually are ways to then get you out because you are an embarrassment to the company name and the reputation. And it really talks about that in the entrance requirements. The other part where that shows up will be under the Family Business Council. The council is a forum for family business to get together and, dare I say it, communicate with each other about the vision and the values and what do you want them to do and how do you want them to do it. And so you would have things that say in the Family Council, we are going to talk about just the different kinds of succession, the succession of value and the succession of authority, this succession of knowledge, and what does it mean, and how are we going to do it, and what's our plan? What's our strategic plan to get there? And then another thing we might talk about in the Family Council is how do these rules and these values guide the operation of the business? And how can we teach our family members what we do. We could plan educational programs. We could have those standards of behavior that I talked about, so that somebody knows that if they have a job there, they just don't go and play golf every other Wednesday, even if you would like to. You talk about legacy, you talk about philanthropy and how important it is for this family business to give to the community. And so if you're part of this family, this is what we want to do. And this is where you adopt those policies about regulating how relatives can enter and exit from the business, and the code of conduct for the business. So it all goes to that. And so then, you prepare the future generations for the responsibilities that come with ownership, which is critical, how to do that. To get ready for that, we often discuss what we call the wants and the needs of the family business, so that we're really working with what does the current family business leader want and need. And usually it's retirement and financial security and a control and a say, that they're willing to cut back on commitment and authority, but they're going to need to see the next gen do something. I want to transfer my ownership, but I need the next generation to do something. And so some of the issues are this procrastination. Some issues have to do with insufficient interest outside the company that we had talked about. Sometimes they're unable to transfer the knowledge. They created it, but they don't know how to transfer it. Or they're just sort of waiting for Junior to be mature enough. That was that situation I talked about where Junior was 65 but wasn't quite ready, which is interesting. Not comfortable. Here's a interesting one, that not comfortable about the new technology, and also don't believe that the new generation have the same values. So you talk about that in the family council. That not familiar with the techniques of the technology, sorry for the two T's there, but what that can lead to is, this is the way I've always done it, and this is the way I expect you to do it. And if it is, for example, which is a true story, keeping payroll in a ledger book that is handwritten with handwritten checks, because he doesn't believe in any payroll system and technology, and none of this, deposit from the bank directly, there can be a conflict between the new gen going, what are you doing? Why don't you just go online and do it and hire somebody to do the banking, and get it done? And the old, where they are not comfortable with this new system. And at the family council, that's where you talk about stuff like that. The appetite for risk is also talked about, because even though the newer generation says, sure, I'll sign the bond, I'll sign it at the bank, we want to have a new building, sure, I'll sign that. How about some new equipment? I'll sign that. The older one is sort of like, whoa, wait a second. I'm not in my accumulation stage of wealth. I'm in my preservation stage of wealth, and I don't want some bank reaching into it. So it's really something that you have to work out, because the next generation leader, what they want is control and income, obviously, but also recognition that they're doing a good job. They would like to grow the business, and to do it, they often will say, but the controlling generation needs to let me do blank. Step out of the way, do this, do something like that. Many times the younger generation, we're covering a lot of psychology here, but they're going to be resistant to what some of us would consider advice and what they consider criticism. So you have to watch that. The other thing you have to watch is what we call the influencers. That's also known as pillow talk, where you can have a terrible situation with in-laws where the in-law will be whispering to one of the siblings about how unfair it is that the other sibling has a new car or makes more money or they took a vacation or they have better hours. And this whispering in the ear creates a jealousy that is difficult to overcome unless it's talked about. Oh, there's that communication word again. And the best way of doing that is in a family council. You don't want to do it where the situation is what we call in family business a triangle. If, for example, if dad thinks son isn't working hard enough, dad will go to mom to complain about son. Son goes to mom to complain about dad about he's so controlling. What you haven't had is that dad and son are talking. And so that triangle creates issues going forward. There's also a problem, and I know we want to make sure we have questions, so I'm trying to speed it up. But the other thing is, and don't forget to ask your questions, by the way, just type them in. The problem between the earned wealth and the inherited wealth. So the older generation says, hey, I made this money, I worked hard, and this younger generation, they just think, it's theirs. They're entitled, a terrible word. And unfortunately a real world in the sense of family business, that they just think they're entitled. And so there are ways to fix that without causing problems, especially between siblings. So you have that sibling rivalry that you have to talk about at the family council, and you have to talk about this inherited and earned wealth. Many times the older generation will believe that the younger one is living beyond their means. They're just not as good at saving or watching spending, so they're sort of afraid to turn over the business because they think they're just going to spend it all. It's a matter of talking about it and getting it done. And then you have to be careful because there are other family members, the ones that are not going to be in the business, the ones that really are, the mailbox owners, and they truly just want to check. And so you want to make sure that you don't have that. The ownership issues are vital to understand the different types of owners that there are in a family business, because you can have the operating owner who is managing day to day. He's got the finger on the pulse of the company. He knows where everything is going. And then the next one, maybe the person working in the business who is, coming along is going to be interested. He got a little piece and he's working hard and he wants to take it over, and he really wants to be able to be the operating owner and to work hard. So what you have to be careful of is when you are splitting this ownership and you have somebody who we call a captive owner, that inherited the ownership. So he got it from dad. He never really wanted it. All it is a piece of paper. He doesn't really want to be part of the business. And so what happens is they'd sell it if they could, and they just hold a grudge, and they just cause problems whenever they can. And that's almost as bad as the entitled owner who has been given the stock and their expectations are way out of line with reality. So in your buy-sell agreement that you have, there are ways to deal with all those different types of owners to get them out if they turn into a burdened, complaining owner who all they want to do is create, throw the grenade in the middle of it. There should be ways in the buy-sell to get out that person. The good buy-sell is going to cover your death, disability, divorce, and dissension. And then that unhappy captive owner I talked about, you could have what is called a put and a call, so you can get that captive owner out. You don't have to keep somebody in the business who is really unhappy and does not like it anymore. Let me see, I want to run through this. Here's the business trust that we talked about. You hold it for the next generation, distribute it after certain requirements are made and they are comfortable with it. Your entrance requirements we talked about, college, outside work, military, when are you going to come in? Very important to decide when you're coming in. And then that family council, I can't stress that enough. Sometimes people take the opportunity to do that 2 to 4 times a year. And quite frankly, sometimes people go away for it. They don't just have it after work at 5 o'clock. They say, we are going to take Saturday, we're going to go to a state park, or we're going to go to a resort, and you guys get in the mornings, we're going to have meetings, and the afternoons is free time, and then we're going to get together again in the morning. But it is a working family council, and something that people really need to consider. So, as we said before, ask the question, and we have some time left so I can answer it. And Ivy, you want to take the first one?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for that presentation. We have quite a few questions coming in already, so we'll just dive in. So we have a question from an audience member who says, I have 3 children. My youngest of the 3 siblings is the only one that is helping with my business. I am 62 and hope to retire by 65. At what point does the business become 100% my youngest? And the youngest is only 28. So what advice would you give for that situation?
My advice would be is to have a meeting, and you first ask the important question to the 28-year-old, do you want to have the business? And obviously the answer is going to be yes. So let's assume the answer is yes. I would immediately start and have the business appraised. Family business owners sometimes do not have any idea how much the business is worth. They either think it's too much or too little. You really just have an outside appraiser. It's the best thing. That's not very expensive. You have that done. Then you could gift a piece of it to the 28-year-old. So let's say you give 10% right now with a buy-sell, right? If you don't take anything away from today, you have to have a buy-sell. So you have the buy-sell, you have the 28. You now have a period of time that you can be working side by side with the daughter who is an owner. And as an owner, then the daughter will see the financials. She will be consulted over some things. You should start to consult her over some of your expenses, some of your income challenges, some of your expense challenges. And if you want to retire at 65, you should be able to do that. There are ways to do that. Would you get rid of 100% of your stock then? You don't need to. My guess is you're going to figure out a time that you feel comfortable. Let's say it's 67. I'm making it up. You can say to, right now, and say, all right, I'm 62 now. I'm going to give you a 5-year window. I'm going to give you some 10% now. I'll give you 10% next year. By the time I am 67, you will have 100%, and you will owe me money on a note because you're going to buy the rest off. And then that's what you would do. Does that answer it, do you think, Ivy?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
So we have another question related to this, in that, obviously it's good to start planning early, but for those who maybe didn't start planning as early as they wanted or needed to, We have someone asking about a family business, sole proprietor that has been in business for 50 years. He's just decided that his 27-year-old nephew, who is qualified, should be his successor. However, he's 73 and never really planned. How can they fast forward that process?
Yeah, the answer will be very similar. You have a meeting. I'm free tomorrow, and you have the meeting, and you do it right away, and you start talking about it right away. And in fact, what you could do is, if that is the chosen one, as we call it sometimes, if the nephew's the chosen one, you can then arrange it, and then you would have a note that would be paid. Let's say it's paid over 10 years. If something happens to you, the rest of the note would be paid to your estate. But it's not too late.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have a question about, what happens if an outside person wants to buy the business, but a family member wants to keep his options open to be a partner as well with this new person in perhaps 5 years or so?
You could do that by way of the buy-sell. You could write it in such a way that that other person, you could write the option open, is what you write, right in the buy-sell. You'd leave that opportunity open. And it's really quite easy to do.
Great. Do you have any advice for what to do when family members have been involved in the business but don't show any interest in carrying it on?
Yes. If there are no family members that are interested in carrying it on, it's good to know sooner rather than later. And so sell it. Talk to somebody. There's several of us who are very knowledgeable about selling a family business to get premium dollars for the family business. If nobody's interested in it, that is the time to think about, all right, what am I going to do? Because most people would like to have the cash to retire on and to live on, and also most people have most of their wealth tied up in the family business. So if you don't have anybody interested in carrying it on, then the appropriate thing to do is to think about selling.
Yeah. We have another question from one of our attendees who says, if a child buys into part of the business, when I die, does the remainder of what I own get split between all the children or only the kids that are not involved in the business?
Well, again, getting back to my first premise is only the voting stock should go to the children who are in the business. So you don't want to leave the voting stock to children who are not in the business. So the thing to do now is to have perhaps some voting and some non-voting stock. And in your will and your trust, you could leave non-voting stock to your other children and the voting stock to the children who are in the business. Let's say the business is worth $1 million and your entire estate is $2 million, including that million, and you have 3 children. First of all, the $1 million value for the business is not necessarily in your will what you're going to value it, because that child's going to get the headache discount because there are headaches involved with running the business. So then let's say you discount it by 25%, it would be worth $750, and you divide the rest up so that each other one got $750 in cash.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So now we have a question related to this idea of leadership. We have an attendee who says, I have 2 sons in the business, both VPs. They operate differently but with good results. How do I go about making one of them president?
The inability to choose. One thing to do is you would have a family council meeting. And with these family council meetings, we strongly recommend you have an outside facilitator, someone who is experienced in family business councils, to lead the discussion so you don't just ruin Thanksgiving dinner, all right? So you're going to want to have somebody who's experienced lead this. And then the discussion starts with, between you two, first of all, do both of you think that you are qualified to run it? You would be surprised, 9 times out of 10, one of the two will say, I like what I do, I really don't want to run it. And so then your decision is easy. But if you don't have communication, you're never going to know. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if they're both saying, I want it, and the other one says, I want it, and the other one says, I want it, you have to really analyze what the business is, what are they doing, what part are they doing, and then you can decide if you can make divisions. So by that I mean, split the company into 2 divisions and then have them both own them both, but they could be president of their own division. So there are ways to handle it.
Great. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for the Q&A session.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, everyone, I know. Everyone,
Okay.
I just want to say that if you go to our attachments tab, you can find the website for Ms. Wolfer's law firm. If you have questions and want to follow up, you can also find Manta on Twitter and ask questions there, continue the conversation.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and spending your time with us today. And I just want to remind everyone, too, that this webinar will be available for on-demand viewing within 24 hours. And there's also a link to Manta's other webinars and archived webinars in the attachment section. So if you want to go back and review any part of this presentation, you should be able to do that. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And once again, thank you so much to Prime Corporate Services for sponsoring this event.
Thank you very much.